Diane Whitfield stood in her kitchen on a quiet Tuesday morning, the smell of coffee still fresh in the air, when her husband of 27 years placed a thick envelope on the table and said 4 words that would break her world apart. "I want a divorce." No warning, no argument the night before. No sign that this was coming after nearly 3 decades of marriage, 2 children raised, a home built together, and a life she thought was solid as stone. She stared at the envelope, her hands trembling, unable to understand how the man she had loved since she was 22 years old could look her in the eyes and hand her papers instead of an explanation. But what neither Diane nor anyone in her family could have known that morning was that this was only the beginning of a truth so shocking it would change everything they believed about the man named Robert Whitfield. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. To understand how a marriage that lasted 27 years could collapse in a single morning, we have to go back to where it all began. Diane and Robert met in the autumn of 1998 in a small town in Ohio, at a community college where both of them were working part-time jobs to pay their way through school. Robert was quiet and hardworking, the kind of young man who noticed details other people missed. Diane was warm and full of laughter, the kind of woman who made every room feel lighter. They fell in love slowly, over long walks and cheap diner coffee, and within 2 years they were married in a small church with fewer than 40 guests, promising each other a lifetime of loyalty through whatever came their way. Their early years were far from easy. Robert worked long shifts at a manufacturing plant, while Diane took evening classes to become a nurse. Money was tight, and there were nights they ate nothing but rice and beans just to make rent. But through every hardship, they stayed close, building a partnership rooted in sacrifice. When their first child, a daughter named Emily, was born, Robert took on a second job just to cover hospital bills. 2 years later, their son Michael arrived, and the family of 4 settled into a modest home on the edge of town, a home Robert would later spend years renovating with his own hands, board by board, on weekends when he could have been resting. By the time their children were teenagers, Robert had worked his way up from the factory floor to a supervisor position and eventually partnered with a longtime co-worker named Daniel Ashworth to start a small manufacturing supply business of their own. Diane, meanwhile, had become a respected nurse at the local hospital, known for her patience and her steady hands. To everyone who knew them, the Whitfields were the picture of the American dream, a couple who had climbed out of hardship through sheer determination and love for one another. Friends often said they hoped to have a marriage like Robert and Diane's, one that had weathered every storm and come out stronger. No one imagined that the storm still waiting for them would be the hardest one yet. The signs, looking back, had been there for almost a year before the divorce papers appeared. Robert had grown quieter at dinner, often distracted, checking his phone more than usual, and stepping outside to take calls he never explained. He started coming home later from the office, sometimes missing family dinners altogether, offering only vague reasons about the business needing more of his attention. Diane noticed, but she trusted her husband completely after 27 years together, and she assumed the stress was simply work-related. Their daughter Emily, now 26, and living nearby, mentioned to her mother that she had seen her father having lunch with an unfamiliar woman downtown, a woman later identified only as Grace Calloway. Diane brushed it off at the time, unwilling to entertain suspicion toward the man she had built her entire life around. But as winter approached, Robert's behavior grew harder to ignore. He began sleeping in the guest room, citing back pain that never seemed to improve. He grew thinner, his color paler, though he insisted he was simply tired from work. He started making trips to Columbus that he never fully explained, sometimes disappearing for entire weekends, under the excuse of business meetings with Daniel Ashworth. Diane's sister, visiting for Thanksgiving, quietly warned her that something felt wrong, that Robert seemed like a man carrying a secret too heavy to speak aloud. Diane defended her husband fiercely, refusing to believe that the man who had held her hand through childbirth, through her mother's funeral, through every hardship imaginable, could possibly be hiding something that would hurt her. Then came the morning in early spring, when Robert placed the envelope on the kitchen table. Diane remembers every detail of that moment. The way the sunlight hit the counter, the sound of the refrigerator humming, the trembling in her own fingers as she opened the papers and saw the words, "Petition for dissolution of marriage," typed in cold, formal print. She looked up at her husband, waiting for him to take it back, to laugh and say it was some terrible misunderstanding. Instead, Robert simply said he was sorry, that it was something he needed to do, and that he could not explain everything right now, but promised she would understand eventually. Then he picked up a small bag he had already packed and walked out the front door, leaving Diane standing alone in the kitchen, where they had shared thousands of ordinary mornings together. Word spread quickly through their small community. Robert Whitfield, a man once admired for his devotion to his family, was suddenly the subject of harsh judgment. Neighbors whispered about the mysterious woman seen with him downtown. Friends who had known the couple for decades expressed disbelief and anger on Diane's behalf. Their son Michael, now 23, refused to speak to his father at all, calling him a coward for abandoning his mother without explanation after everything she had given to their family. Emily, though equally hurt, tried to reach out to her father for answers, but Robert remained distant, offering only short, guarded responses that gave the family nothing to hold on to. It seemed as though the man they had known their entire lives had become a stranger overnight, and no one could understand why. Diane, meanwhile, tried to hold herself together for the sake of her children and her patients at the hospital. She moved out of the family home Robert had built with his own hands and into a small apartment across town, taking only her most essential belongings, unable to bear looking at the house that held so many memories of a marriage she believed had been real. She continued working double shifts, partly out of necessity and partly because staying busy was the only way she could keep from breaking down entirely. Friends brought her meals. Her sister stayed with her some nights, just so she would not be alone. Diane cried more in those weeks than she had in her entire adult life, mourning not just her marriage, but the version of her husband she thought she had known completely. Weeks passed, and the divorce moved forward through the courts with unusual speed, largely because Robert refused to contest any of Diane's requests, agreeing to nearly every term she proposed without argument. This surprised everyone who knew him, since Robert had always been a careful, detail-oriented man when it came to finances and paperwork. Diane's lawyer even remarked privately that it seemed as though Robert wanted the divorce finalized as quickly as legally possible, almost as if time itself were working against him. Diane, still reeling from heartbreak, barely registered this detail at the time, too consumed by grief to notice the urgency behind her husband's sudden and uncharacteristic cooperation. Then, only 6 weeks after the divorce was finalized, the Whitfield family received a phone call that would change everything once again. Robert had collapsed at his office and been rushed to the same hospital where Diane worked as a nurse. Despite everything that had happened between them, Diane rushed to his side, unable to ignore 27 years of love, simply because of the papers that now legally separated them. Doctors worked for nearly an hour, but Robert Whitfield passed away that evening from a sudden cardiac event, leaving behind a family shattered by grief they had not expected to feel so soon after their anger. Diane stood in the hospital corridor, unable to process the fact that the man who had just torn her heart apart was now gone forever, taking whatever secret he had been carrying with him. The days following Robert's death passed in a blur of funeral arrangements and unanswered questions. Emily and Michael, despite their anger toward their father in his final months, found themselves overwhelmed with grief they had not anticipated, along with a growing sense of guilt for the harsh words they had said to him before his passing. Diane, though legally no longer his wife, organized much of the funeral herself, unable to let anyone else handle the final goodbye for the man she had spent nearly her entire adult life beside. The small church where they had married nearly 3 decades earlier was filled with mourners, many of them confused about how to process the loss of a man whose final months had left so many unanswered questions hanging over the family. It was during the reading of Robert's will, held 1 week after the funeral in the office of longtime family attorney Harold Sinclair, that the truth the family had been missing finally began to surface. Mr. Sinclair explained that the will being read had actually been drafted and signed nearly 2 years earlier, long before the divorce proceedings had ever begun, and had never been updated or revoked despite everything that followed. The family exchanged confused glances as Sinclair continued, explaining that under the terms of this original will, the vast majority of Robert's assets, including his share of the business, his savings, and even the family home, had been left entirely to Diane, his wife, with no mention of the divorce that legally should have altered these arrangements. Michael was the first to speak, asking how a divorced man's will could leave everything to the woman he had just left. Mr. Sinclair explained that legally, because the will predated the divorce, and Robert never created a new one afterward, courts would likely honor the original document's intentions, especially given the additional documentation Robert had prepared alongside it. It was at this moment that Sinclair reached into his file and withdrew a sealed letter, handwritten by Robert himself, addressed to his family, and instructed to be read aloud only after the will had been fully explained. The room fell into a heavy silence as Sinclair unfolded the letter, and Diane felt her heart pounding as she realized she was finally about to understand the truth behind the man she had loved for 27 years. In the letter, Robert explained that nearly a year before the divorce, he had discovered that his business partner, Daniel Ashworth, had been secretly taking out large loans against their company, using both of their names as collateral, without Robert's knowledge or consent. When the fraud was eventually uncovered by federal auditors, Robert learned that he could personally be held liable for millions of dollars in debt tied to Ashworth's illegal financial dealings. Debt that could have stripped Diane of everything she had worked for her entire life, including the home she loved, and even her nursing pension. Robert wrote that he had spent months quietly meeting with lawyers and financial advisors, including a woman named Grace Calloway, who was in fact not a romantic partner at all, but a forensic accountant hired to help him untangle the fraudulent paperwork Ashworth had created. Robert explained that after consulting with legal counsel, he learned that the only way to fully protect Diane from being pursued for Ashworth's debts was to legally separate their finances entirely before the fraud investigation became public, ensuring that any judgment against Robert could not extend to property or accounts held solely in Diane's name. Rather than explain the entire situation and risk Diane being questioned or implicated in the ongoing federal investigation, Robert made the painful decision to file for divorce quickly and quietly, protecting her through legal distance while he faced the coming storm of lawsuits and investigations alone. He wrote that watching Diane's heartbreak during those final weeks had been the hardest thing he had ever done, but that he could not bear the thought of her losing everything she had built because of a betrayal that was never her fault. The letter continued, revealing that Robert had also been diagnosed with a serious heart condition just months before the divorce, a condition his doctors warned could result in sudden cardiac failure at any time, though he chose not to share this diagnosis with his family, believing it would only add to the crisis Diane was already facing because of the fraud investigation. He wrote that he had accepted his failing health quietly, determined to use whatever time he had left protecting the people he loved, rather than burdening them with fear about his own mortality. Robert explained that he had refused to contest the divorce terms quickly, not out of indifference, but because he desperately wanted the legal separation finalized before either the fraud case became public or his health declined further, racing against time to shield Diane before it was too late. As Mr. Sinclair finished reading the letter, the room remained silent, the weight of Robert's sacrifice settling over every member of the family. Emily wept quietly, overwhelmed with guilt over the anger she had directed at her father in his final weeks, unaware that he had been fighting a battle far larger than any of them understood. Michael sat frozen, replaying the harsh words he had spoken to his father, words he could never take back now that Robert was gone. Diane, through her tears, finally understood the distance and secrecy that had confused her for nearly a year, realizing that the man she had loved for 27 years had chosen to endure heartbreak, illness, and public judgment alone, rather than allow financial ruin to touch the family he had spent his entire life protecting. In the weeks that followed, the fraud case against Daniel Ashworth became public, confirming every detail Robert had written in his letter. Investigators found that Ashworth had forged signatures and manipulated financial records for nearly 2 years, accumulating debts that could have devastated anyone connected to the business. Because of the divorce Robert had finalized just in time, Diane's personal assets, including the family home and her retirement savings, remained fully protected from the resulting lawsuits, exactly as Robert had intended. Grace Calloway, the forensic accountant so many neighbors had wrongly assumed was Robert's mistress, came forward publicly to confirm every detail of their professional relationship, clearing Robert's name of the accusations that had painted him as unfaithful during his final months. With the truth finally revealed, the Whitfield family began the slow process of healing from a wound they never expected to face. Diane found herself grieving her husband twice, once when she believed he had abandoned her, and again now that she understood the depth of his sacrifice on her behalf. She often visited his grave in the quiet cemetery outside their small Ohio town, sitting beside the headstone and speaking softly to him, as though he could still hear her, thanking him for a love so selfless it had chosen her protection over his own comfort in his final days. Emily and Michael, now aware of the truth, worked to reconcile their memories of their father, choosing to remember him not for the confusion of his final months, but for the quiet courage he had shown in protecting the people he loved most. Months later, as the legal matters finally settled, Diane used part of her inheritance to establish a small scholarship fund in Robert's name at the local community college, where they had first met nearly 30 years earlier, offering financial assistance to working students struggling to balance jobs and education, just as they once had. She often told her children that despite everything that had happened, she had come to believe her marriage had never truly ended in betrayal, but in an act of love so profound it had been mistaken for abandonment. The Whitfield family, forever changed by the events of that difficult year, chose to carry forward the lesson Robert's sacrifice had taught them, that sometimes the people we love most will endure the heaviest burdens quietly, simply to spare us from carrying them ourselves. Today, Diane continues her work as a nurse, now mentoring younger staff, at the same hospital where she once rushed to her husband's side one final time. She speaks openly to close friends about the importance of communication in marriage, often reflecting that even the strongest relationships can be tested by secrets kept out of love, rather than deception. Emily and Michael have grown closer to their mother since that painful year, bonded by the shared understanding of what their father sacrificed for their family's protection. And though the town where they built their life together has moved on from the whispers and speculation that once surrounded the Whitfield name, those closest to the family still remember Robert, not for the divorce papers that once broke his wife's heart, but for the hidden will and the quiet letter that finally revealed the depth of a love that lasted far beyond 27 years of marriage.